The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Ted Shaw, Professor of Law at Columbia University, former Director of the Legal Defense Fund. Glad to have you with us today, Ted.
Always good to be with you, Dr. Brown.
Well, I have a lot of good lawyer friends, and you're one of my good lawyer friends. I don't need you for opinions on my personal life, but I need you for opinions on what's happening in this great country. And I want to begin with the nomination of Judge Sonia Sotomayor for the Supreme Court. I guess you know Judge Sotomayor and probably have appeared before her. What is your feeling about this nomination?
Well, actually, I haven't appeared before her. I've been in the courtroom when I was head of the Legal Defense Fund, and we've had some cases in the Second Circuit. You know, I haven't had the honor of appearing before her, but she was my high school classmate. And so
Really?
We were in the same class at Cardinal Spellman High School. She was #1 in the class. And so I've known her since our freshman year in high school, and I've stayed in contact with her off and on over the years. And, you know, once in a while I see her, and we'll sit down and have a meal or something like that. And I was hoping for this, praying for it, and I'm excited about it. I think it's a superb choice, a great nomination, and she's going to bring a lot to the court and to the country.
Well, I think that President Obama, in making that selection, considered all of those things: her brilliance, her court experience. I understand she has more experience in various courts than some of the judges, the justices who were appointed, like 17 years against 7 for some of them altogether.
Well, that's right. She's been a trial judge, and there's no other judge or justice, I should say, in the Supreme Court sitting now, I believe, who's been a trial judge. So she knows what it means to be a trial judge, and she's been on the U.S. Court of Appeals now. So she's had that experience. She's deep experience, and she also brings an intellectual heft to the court. You know, some of these far-right wingers and others have been putting out some nonsense about her intellectual capacity, but she, as I said, was #1 in my high school class, and Cardinal Spellman at the time was one of the best high schools in the city academically. And then, of course, she excelled at Princeton. You know, the stories she talks about how she got to Princeton and had to go back and relearn some things. But you know what? She was brilliant
Before she got
at
there.
every stage. That's right. And then, you know, law review at Yale and excelled there. I mean, this is a woman who really has achieved at the highest level wherever she's been. So when these folks attack her and question her intellectual capacity, it says much more about them than it does about her.
Well, basically, it's an ideological thing. The conservatives want to control the court, want to deal with issues of affirmative action, Roe versus Wade, and things like that. And they want to attack anybody who has a broader view. Now, you worked with the Legal Defense Fund, you ran it, and you dealt with civil rights and cases involving the rights of individuals in terms of Constitution. How do you think that plays out both intellectually and practically with the new Supreme Court, assuming Judge Sotomayor gets to be confirmed?
Well, as you know, Dr. Brown, this is a court that's been closely and deeply divided when it comes to issues of race and gender and civil rights. Most of the important decisions have been 5-4 decisions. This nomination isn't going to change the balance of the court because, much to the consternation of conservatives, Justice Souter, who of course was a Republican appointee, has voted with the more liberal bloc of justices on the court. And so this is not going to change the balance of the court. In fact, we probably are 1 or 2 appointments away from the balance of the court being affected if the people who are anticipated to retire on the schedule that most people think. You know, the conservatives, they don't really have somebody who's up for grabs anytime soon, absent something unexpected happening. And with respect to civil rights issues and human rights issues before the court, this appointment is nonetheless important. Because, as I said before, all these opinions are being decided 5-4. Justice Kennedy is now the key appointment, with him becoming, I should say, the key vote. With Justice Kennedy now being the so-called swing vote after the retirement of Justice O'Connor, everybody watches Justice Kennedy to see what he's going to do, but the court has shifted even further to the right. He's more conservative than O'Connor was, and make no mistake about it, Justice O'Connor was conservative. Mm-hmm. People act as if she was a liberal now, because maybe her vote in the Michigan case and the way that went, which was extraordinarily important. That was huge. But Justice O'Connor was part of the conservative movement with respect to the court, and Justice Kennedy has moved it even further to the right. And so Justice Sotomayor, what she will bring to it, I anticipate Justice Sotomayor, she's still judge, but what she will bring to it is intellectual heft in the more liberal wing of the court. And it's one thing to have, for example, with all due respect to him, Justice Thomas as the sole minority member of the court, opposed to affirmative action. It's another thing to have a Justice Sotomayor who has another view, who's open to it. And all of a sudden, there's going to be another voice that the others on the court are going to hear that comes from the experience of being African American or Latina.
Let me ask this. The conservatives always talk about the intellectual basis of their opposition to affirmative action. What, if any, is the intellectual basis of the opposition to affirmative action? Well,
you know, this is an issue that I wrestle with often. I spoke not long ago down at a Federalist Society / Heritage Foundation event at the Heritage Foundation. First time I've ever been in that building. So for me, it's like going in the lion's den. And, you know, if you give the opponents of affirmative action, the hard right-wing conservatives, their due, if you take for granted at face value what they say, they really are committed to a colorblind society, and they think any consciousness of race equals racial discrimination, and they think that white males and other white people are now victimized by a system of discrimination against them that puts unqualified African Americans, Latinos, minorities, to some degree maybe women, although that's not really their issue as much as it is the issues of race and ethnicity, at least as I see it, but in positions for which they're not qualified. That is the best light that I can put on their views. The difficulty I have is that these are folks, by and large, who were completely absent, missing in action when it came to the struggle against discrimination that was visited upon African Americans or Latinos. You know, that's my difficulty. And to the extent that some of them or their intellectual predecessors, because some of them are leaving the scene now, were active, they were active on the wrong side of these issues. So, you know, that's my problem. How does one devote his or her whole life to and energy to fighting measures that will open up opportunities to people who have historically been excluded from opportunity? You know, how does that become the great evil in our society all of a sudden? When, in spite of the fact that we have President Obama, we still have disparities that are rooted in all of this long history of discrimination against African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, etc. It's not that their arguments in all circumstances are without some legitimacy or questions, but I find it difficult to really understand what their ideological motivation is if I give them the benefit of the doubt.
Well, one thing that they talk about is placing unqualified people into colleges and to jobs, yet when you look at performance data, both in education And the job market, the so-called unqualified people perform as well or better than the so-called qualified people based on tests.
Well, one of the things about affirmative action is that the conservatives immediately want to slap a quota label on it and talk about unqualified people. I think we should all agree that people who are not qualified shouldn't be given positions for which they are not qualified. That's a no-brainer. What I think of when I think about affirmative action is finding people who are qualified, who, for reasons of structural inequality in this country, have been excluded from the mainstream opportunities.
By the way, you use a term that's a legal term, structural inequality. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is that we can talk about racial discrimination that individuals may engage in against another individual. Somebody calling somebody the N-word and denying them a job opportunity. I mean, that's raw stuff. That's the kind of stuff that we dealt with, in the pre-civil rights movement era, and even after that to some degree. But discrimination nowadays is much more subtle, and it may not be the consequence of an individual motivated by antipathy or an animus that's rooted in racism. It may be the consequence of the fact that people are born into a society in which some folks still have less opportunity. If you're born into a black neighborhood, isolated neighborhood in East New York, and you go to crumbling public schools with poor academics, in no way is the playing field even for you. You may be somebody who has the potential to be brilliant, but if you don't have the playing field even, that's structural inequality. Where people are born, the housing that they live in, the schools they attend, the jobs that are available to them, the education they're given, all of that is part of this structural inequality that we've inherited, and we still have work to do to dismantle this system of what was American apartheid. Now, no question, we've done extraordinary things. We've elected the first African American as President of the United States. We've made extraordinary progress. But the playing field isn't entirely even yet. One excuse is off the table, I think, nowadays, and that's that, it's now possible for any black child to look at the President of the United States and say, that can be me. That's extraordinary. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the path is going to be as easily available and open to a black child born in poverty. So, that's what I talk about when I say structural inequality.
Some of the conservatives say that all that being true, if someone of a minority group really worked hard and did all the things, they could do as well as somebody from the white group. How do you refute that argument?
Well, I don't have to refute it. I mean, the promise of America, is that you can rise from humble beginnings, and you can do anything. In some respects, that's true.
Particularly if you can dunk a basketball and write a hit song.
Yeah, which on some level or another is great. On another level, for me, it's not enough.
Not enough.
But certainly there are a lot of people who are getting rich doing that. But if you ask the question of whether it means something in this country to be born poor and black, it still means something, or Latino. We still have, by any measure, lower levels of academic achievement. The schools in poverty-impacted neighborhoods, and conservatives will say, "Well, okay, deal with poverty, well, and not race." But the truth of the matter is that concentrated poverty is largely a black and increasingly a Latino phenomenon. Poor white people, whom we also have to address. We need to do something about their conditions. But for the most part, Appalachia, maybe a few other places excluded, poor white people are not spatially concentrated. They live among middle-class people. They go to schools that are largely middle class. They don't deal with education that is impacted by concentrations of poverty, which is devastating. That's still a black and brown phenomenon, and there's still work to be done to dismantle that phenomenon. That's what I talk about when I say structural inequality. That's what I mean.
Well, with the Legal Defense Fund, you dealt with many of these issues. you talked about the University of Michigan case, which you were involved in, which had to do with the use of race and selective admissions. How do you think that has worked out? You know, Bollinger, who started that, is now the president of Columbia University. How do you think the response to the Michigan case has worked out?
Well, the University of Michigan case was hugely important because the question was whether elite institutions of higher education were going to continue to keep their doors open to significant numbers of qualified minority students. I think it's worked out fairly well for the most part. Ironically, in Michigan, it didn't work out as well ultimately because the people of Michigan had a voter initiative that was brought in by Ward Connolly, California, Proposition 209.
African-American conservative.
Right. I don't know that he identifies himself as African-American, but he is. Now in Michigan they cannot consciously try to do anything to enroll minority students, even though you still have the disparities in Detroit as opposed to the suburbs, etc. But for the most part, it's worked out very well. You know, Judge Sotomayor, absolutely qualified by any measure to be on the Supreme Court or do anything else she wants to do. I grew up in a public housing project in the Bronx, not far from the project in which I grew up. We went to the same high school. The light of opportunity prior to the advent of affirmative action didn't shine in Bronxdale houses or Castle Hill houses where I grew up. And it didn't mean that there weren't people there who were capable, but that opportunity wasn't there. That's what affirmative action properly structured does. It finds those people and gives those people opportunity. And you know, she doesn't deny that she was a beneficiary of affirmative action. I certainly don't. But I also say that she was qualified, and I feel I was qualified for the opportunities that came my way as a consequence.
Well, what about the Constitution? Does the Constitution really guarantee you the opportunity to move ahead, or do you have to earn it by test grades and achievement, et cetera? What about that? That's
well, the Constitution, you know, there's no right to quality education that's recognized by the U.S. Constitution. Most Americans don't really understand that. They don't get that. We kind of feel like there ought to be some guarantee of quality education. But constitutionally, it doesn't exist. The Constitution doesn't guarantee anybody the right to get ahead. What it does is protect against discrimination. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause says no person should be denied equal protection of the law. More accurately, nor shall any state deny anybody equal protection of the law. That also is applied to the federal government also. So, you know, we have a Constitution that prevents discrimination or prohibits discrimination. It doesn't give a positive right to quality education. So, you know, we have a Supreme Court decision in 1973 that says education is not a fundamental right. It also says that poverty is not a protected classification. You know, you can be discriminated against when you're poor. I think that that's unfortunate, but that's where our Constitution lies, and we have to deal with the Constitution that we have.
Can that be challenged legally?
No, that's been decided by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter of the Constitution. The only thing that could happen is that the American people could vote to change the Constitution. But absent that, you know, if you're talking about an interpretation of the Constitution itself, what the Supreme Court says is the final word. If it's statutory, if there's a law that's passed by Congress, then Congress can come back and deal with something that the Supreme Court says and say no to the court, or effectively say, okay, we're going to repass this law. But you can't do that if it's a constitutional decision interpreting the Constitution.
Well, see, as the country is changing, 2009, 2010, 2015, the population of the country is changing, the demographics are changing, the economics are changing. Does that not mean that some of the social positions that we hold true might change?
Well, certainly, you know, the country is undergoing tremendous change. Again, you know, I keep coming back to President Obama. Who in our generation, and when I say our generation, I'm being presumptuous, but I'm talking about the people who were born either before Brown versus Board of Education or in the immediate aftermath. Who thought we'd actually see a black president in our life? Maybe a few of us dreamed it, but it was only a dream up until now. So certainly the country is changing. The Constitution, however, has to be interpreted based upon what the Constitution says, what it actually says. There has to be some basis or some reasonable interpretation of what the Constitution says. The great debate is whether you're limited to the words of the Constitution, the original, meaning of the Constitution, or whether we have what's called a living Constitution. Well, I think the framers of the Constitution understood that they were creating a document that would have to serve well into the future, and that it needed flexibility. So the question isn't whether you have to interpret the Constitution. The question is how much leeway you have, and that's where the debate occurs.
Well, when you say that, I thought myself, do you really believe that? They were slaveholders, they excluded women, they didn't respect them.
Yeah.
How could they dream of a Constitution that would do all the wonderful things that we say it does now?
I don't think they did. I think they were limited by their time, and one of the dilemmas for somebody like me, or all of us really, I'm a constitutional scholar and a professor of law. I respect the Constitution, but I also know how deeply flawed it was. It took a civil war to set the stage to undo the deeply flawed interpretation of the Constitution that the framers created. So it's not that they were perfect.
Yeah.
Did they have any wisdom? I think they did. Were they deeply flawed? Slaves they were. Are they people who would have respected you and me as human beings? Many of them, no. The slaveholders, certainly not. But did they create a document that we can own? When I think about the framers of the Constitution, I don't stop with the original framers. I think about, John Bingham from Ohio, congressman from Ohio, who helped to craft and draft the 14th Amendment. I think about Frederick Douglass, who, while not in Congress, still had a great influence on the framing of the post-Civil War amendments. I think about all those who, in the era of the 39th Congress, that adopted the 14th Amendment, and those that adopted the 13th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, they were also framers of the Constitution. And I can connect with them as much, if not more, than the original framers of the Constitution, although I can respect some of what the original framers did.
Well, with this dichotomy between liberals and conservatives and people in the middle, we're finding that the hard right is getting smaller and smaller, but much more aggressive.
I hope so.
Much more aggressive. Now, what does that mean for people who are liberal or in the middle in terms of how do you deal with those very right-wing positions on things like abortion and women's rights and minority rights? Well,
I think to the extent that the hard right is becoming a smaller group, politically they won't have the numbers. It's like the opposition to Justice, I should say to Judge Sotomayor's nomination, and the hard right people who are attacking her. They don't have the votes right now, but they may be saying some toxic things, and it gets out there in the public.
That's true.
What I hope is that the public understands who's who. They were prepared to oppose anybody President Obama nominated. They had variations of scripts depending on who the nominee was, but they were going to go after almost anybody as being an activist and too liberal and too this and too that. To the extent that they have their script set, I think you got to let them howl in the wind and make sure people who are more reasonable, that those are the voices who ultimately are heard and have the ultimate say. Let me be clear. It's not that I don't think that conservatives have their place. I draw a distinction between what I call intellectual and instinctive conservatives who are open-minded on the one hand, and people who are ideological, closed-minded. They have an agenda, and that agenda has been inconsistent with expanding or giving rights to people of color, women, other groups who have been historically subordinated.
Now, as the world gets smaller or larger as we move out to various parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America, won't that have some impact on some of the political thinking here? Because we'll be dealing with people who are people of color, people who are different, and because of technology and trade and economics, we're going to have to interact with them. Many of these countries are now trying democracy on their own. To what extent will that influence the way in which we operate here in this country with our democracy?
Oh, I think that the changes in the world have long influenced our democracy here in the United States and vice versa. So, for example, when Brown versus Board of Education was decided, although nobody said a word about it in the opinion, you know, the United States was conscious of the fact that in a post-World War II environment, which was fighting the Cold War, you had this huge hypocrisy. You know, I mean, you fought that war, and you know about the inconsistency and hypocrisy to come home to racial segregation and discrimination. So, you know, the United States was conscious of that then, and we were also in an era of the beginning of the end of colonialism, the emergence of African nations. At the same time, we've influenced the rest of the world in positive ways, sometimes in not so positive ways. I think one of the wonderful things under this administration is that we're taking the right road again and having a positive influence.
And Professor Ted Shaw from Columbia University, former director of the Legal Defense Fund, has been in the forefront of this fight. Thanks again for being with us today, Ted.
Always good to be with you.
Okay, buddy.
All right.